Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Usually when we look at the architecture of a great historical superpower, we expect it to be built, like a modern skyscraper.
Yeah.
You look for the deep concrete foundations, the rigid steel beams, everything engineered for permanence and very clear top-down authority. The blueprint is usually straightforward. The center dictates and the periphery obeys.
Yeah, it is a very comforting, linear way to view history. We inherently want to believe that states which survive for centuries are built on this solid, immovable bedrock.
But then you step into the world of the Sasanian Empire.
Really?
This is the last pre-Islamic Iranian empire. And as you start reading the source material, the inscriptions, the administrative seals, the court chronicles, you realize you are not looking at a modern skyscraper at all.
Not at all.
You are looking at a highly complex, incredibly intricate machine that was held together almost entirely by opposing tensions.
Yeah.
It was a society bound by a rigid religious mandate and an inflexible caste system, yet simultaneously reliant on deeply entrenched quasi-independent warlords.
And that tension is exactly what makes the Sasanian period so deeply compelling. You have this machine that functioned as a centralized superpower for over 4 centuries. It stood toe-to-toe with Rome and later Byzantium, shaping the geopolitics of late antiquity. Yet, the foundation of this massive state was fundamentally volatile. It required constant active management by the monarchy just to prevent it from tearing itself apart.
So in this deep dive, which is part of our Persian history series, we are going to explore how a single family transformed a very fragmented, localized society into that massive imperial machine. We are looking at a time frame from roughly 224 CE to 651.
That's right.
And our mission is to help you understand the mechanics of this empire. We will look at how they pioneered massive landscape-altering engineering, how they enforced a social hierarchy where your profession was dictated by birth, and ultimately how that entire intricate machine suffered one of the most sudden collapses in recorded history.
But to understand the collapse, you first have to understand the construction. And you really cannot understand the construction of the Sasanian state without looking at the ashes of the regime it replaced, which is the Parthian Empire.
Okay, the Parthians.
Yeah. By the early 3rd century CE, the Parthian Ērānšahr dynasty had ruled for nearly 500 years. But to call it a unified empire is, slightly misleading. It was in reality a very decentralized, loose confederacy of regional powers.
Because the Parthian system relied on local vassal kings and powerful noble families, right? Like they maintained their own armies, they minted their own regional coins, and they operated with a massive degree of autonomy.
Precisely. As long as they provided troops and paid tribute to the Parthian great king, they were largely left to their own devices.
But by the early 200s CE, that central Parthian authority was crumbling.
It was. The Parthian central government was completely exhausted by decades of civil war and these really ruinous conflicts with the Roman Empire. And this power vacuum brings us to the origins of the Sasanian state in a region called Persis, which corresponds to the modern Fars province in southern Iran.
And Persis was the ancient heartland of the old Achaemenid Empire, right?
Yes, the empire of Cyrus and Darius.
So it carried immense cultural and historical weight for the region.
Exactly. So around 205 CE, a local ruler in Persis named Papak decided to exploit Parthia's weakness.
Papak is a really interesting figure to start with because he was not just a political leader, he was also a priest of the Anahita temple at the city of Ērānšahr. And Anahita was a major Zoroastrian divinity associated with water, fertility, and war. So right from the very beginning of the Sasanian story, you have this fusion of religious authority and political ambition. Papak overthrows the local Parthian vassal in Persis and essentially declares his region independent.
Right, and that initial rebellion set the stage. But it was Papak's son, Ardashir I, who truly forged the empire.
Okay.
Ardashir takes over the movement and begins a massive, brutal campaign of consolidation. And the scale of what he had to accomplish is pretty staggering. I mean, historical sources suggest Ardashir I had to systematically subdue roughly 120 local chieftains and regional lords just to secure his initial power base.
Let's pause and unpack the logistics of that for a second, because defeating 120 autonomous chieftains without facing a constant, debilitating multi-front rebellion seems logistically impossible.
It does.
It is like a corporate takeover where a new executive comes in, but instead of just restructuring the board of directors, the executive has to literally, physically fight 120 individual board members to consolidate control of the company.
That's a very apt way to look at it.
And he has to somehow keep the company generating revenue while this massive internal war is happening. How does Ardashir I actually manage that?
Well, he managed it through a combination of sheer military force, strategic marriages, and, quite frankly, brutal psychological warfare. Ardashir did not just defeat these chieftains in battle. He systematically dismantled their power bases.
So he didn't just leave them in charge as vassals?
No, not at all. When he conquered a region, he would often execute the ruling family and replace them with his own sons or deeply trusted loyalists. Furthermore, he established entirely new royal cities, such as Firuzabad.
Firuzabad is a perfect example of his strategy, isn't it? It was a circular city, heavily fortified, and designed explicitly to project centralized royal power.
Yeah.
It was not an organic settlement. It was a military and administrative hub built to extract taxes and control the surrounding countryside.
Exactly. These royal cities completely bypassed the old regional networks. By building them, Ardashir diverted the flow of tax revenue directly to his own treasury, starving the remaining regional lords of resources.
That makes sense.
Right. So he forced the surviving chieftains to buy into his new imperial vision by basically holding their remaining status hostage. If they submitted, they received a place in the new court hierarchy. If they resisted, they were annihilated.
So this ruthless consolidation eventually brings Ardashir into direct conflict with the highest authority, which is the Parthian great king himself, Artabanus IV.
Yes.
And the decisive moment arrives on April 28th, 224 CE, at the Battle of Hormozgan.
Right, and while the exact location of Hormozgan is still debated by archaeologists, the outcome is not. Ardashir's newly consolidated forces, hardened by all those years of regional warfare, completely crushed the Parthian royal army. Artabanus IV was killed in the fighting.
Wow, okay.
And with his death, the Ērānšahr dynasty effectively ended, and the Sasanian Empire officially began.
Following the battle, Ardashir I captures the traditional capital, Stisfan, which was located in Mesopotamia near modern Baghdad. He takes the ancient title of Ērānšahr.
King of Kings.
Right, King of Kings. And he immediately begins constructing a state apparatus that consciously models itself on the ancient, highly centralized Achaemenid Empire. He wants to project the idea that the Parthian era was just an interruption, and he is restoring the true ancient Persian order.
And that ideological messaging was carried forward and amplified by his son and successor, Shapur I.
Okay.
Shapur not only expanded the empire's borders significantly, but he also recognized the need to physically document this new order. He commissioned the famous trilingual inscription at the Kabe-i Zardut.
Right, and for those unfamiliar with the Kabe-i Zardut, it is this striking, square, tower-like stone structure located at Nakhoshi Rostam, which is an ancient necropolis near Persepolis.
No, it's an incredible monument.
And Shapur I had a massive inscription carved into the exterior walls of this structure in 3 languages: Middle Persian, Parthian, and Greek. It is essentially the Sasanian Empire's foundational charter.
And the inscription is vital for historians because it explicitly details the provinces of the empire and, crucially, the administrative hierarchy.
Like an org chart.
Exactly like an org chart. It lists the nobles, the court officials, and the royal family members, ranking them by importance. You can read the inscription and see exactly how Ardashir and Shapur actively marginalized the old Parthian vassal kings, replacing them with Sasanian royal princes who were appointed as provincial governors.
So they were building a machine designed to enforce royal authority, collect fixed land taxes, and prevent the kind of fragmentation that destroyed the Parthians.
That was the goal, yes.
But transitioning from conquering a territory to administering it for 400 years requires more than just military dominance. It requires a robust, self-sustaining system of governance.
Absolutely. And at the very top of that machinery was the ideology of the Ērānšahr. Sasanian kingship was not just a political office, it was a deeply religious institution. The King of Kings ruled by absolute divine mandate, and the central concept here is the Quar.
The Quar is a fascinating concept. It translates roughly to divine glory or royal splendor. It was believed to be a tangible, almost physical aura bestowed upon the rightful king by the supreme Zoroastrian deity Ahura Mazda. If you had the Quara, you were the legitimate protector of cosmic and social order. If you lost it, perhaps through unjust rule or a military disaster, you lost your right to the throne.
And you see this concept represented constantly in Sasanian rock reliefs.
Really? How so?
Well, the king is often depicted receiving a diadem, like a ring of power, directly from Ahura Mazda or another divinity. The message to the populace and the nobility was unequivocal. To rebel against the Ērānšahr was not just treason, it was an act of cosmic rebellion against God.
Okay, so a very heavy ideological hammer. But to manage the day-to-day operations of this divinely sanctioned state, there was a vast bureaucratic hierarchy beneath the king. The civil governance, the taxation, the royal treasuries, these were overseen by a figure known as the Wazir, which translates to the Grand Vizier or Chief Minister.
Right. The Wazir was essentially the chief operating officer of the empire. He managed an extensive apparatus of scribes, accountants, and local administrators. The goal of this bureaucracy was always centralization, keeping the flow of information and money directed toward Ctesiphon.
And here is where we hit that central tension we mentioned earlier. Despite this massive bureaucracy and the claims of absolute divine right, the Sasanian kings never completely erased the old nobility.
No, they didn't.
The empire still relied heavily on a class known as the Wuzurgan, the grandees. And specifically, they relied on the 7 great houses.
Yes, the 7 great houses. These were ancient noble clans of Parthian origin families like the Saurin, the Karen, the Miran, and the Ispabutnem. Ardashir I might have destroyed many local chieftains, but these major houses were simply too powerful to eradicate. They held vast hereditary estates, largely in the northern and eastern regions of the empire.
And crucially, these houses controlled the empire's military backbone.
This is the key point.
Because the Sasanian military was centered around the Savaran, the elite, heavily armored cavalry, the horses, the armor, the training, the retainers, all of this was astronomically expensive. The Sasanian crown simply could not afford to fund a standing cavalry of that size entirely out of the royal treasury. They needed the 7 great houses to provide these armored lancers.
And because of this military reliance, the noble houses retained immense privilege. They held the highest provincial governorships, they commanded the armies, they even frequently intermarried with the Sasanian royal line. So the central government was in a perpetual state of negotiation with these families.
Over time, the administration evolved to try and manage this threat, right? By the 6th century, under the reigns of Kavad I and his son Khosrow I, the empire underwent significant structural reforms. They formally divided the empire into 4 massive districts, or kustaks.
Right. You had the northern, eastern, southern, and western quarters, and each of these kustaks was placed under the command of a spabed, which is a supreme military commander.
Now, the traditional narrative is that this reform was purely military, designed to delegate command so the empire could simultaneously fight the Romans in the west and nomadic invaders like the Hephthalites in the east. But there was a deeper political motive, wasn't there?
Oh, absolutely. The 4-spabed system was a deliberate attempt to curb the autonomy of the great houses.
How so?
Well, previously, a single noble might hold the title of Ērānšahr, essentially commander-in-chief of the entire imperial army.
Oh, I see.
By splitting the command 4 ways, Khosrow I was diluting their power. He was bringing military logistics, supply lines, and troop payments directly under the oversight of his central bureaucracy, rather than leaving them in the hands of independent warlords.
This complex dynamic between the central throne and the noble houses has actually sparked a major historiographical debate among modern scholars.
It has. The interpretation of how Sasanian power actually functioned on the ground has shifted considerably over the last century. If you read scholars from the early 20th century, like Arthur Christensen, they paint a picture of the Sasanian Empire as a highly centralized, absolutist, even tyrannical monarchy. In Christensen's view, the king wielded near-total, unquestioned control over the provinces, and the bureaucracy dictated every aspect of life.
But the more recent scholarship pushes back hard against that idea. Historians like Parvana Porcheriati have re-examined the source material and argue that the empire was actually much more of a loose confederacy. In this view, the Sasanian kings were never truly absolute. They were entirely dependent on the Parthian dynastic families.
Yeah, and Porcheriati's analysis suggests that the spabeds and the heads of these great houses often wielded semi-autonomous control over their regional fiefdoms. When the central government was strong, the nobles cooperated. But when the Sasanian kings faced succession crises or major external defeats, this entrenched aristocratic power frequently undermined royal authority, pursuing their own regional interests rather than the empire's survival.
This raises a fundamental question about the structure of the state. You have a king who possesses absolute divine authority, the Kawara from Ahura Mazda. Yet he is forced to tolerate the immense decentralized military power of these 7 great houses. It is a massive contradiction.
It is.
Think of it like So If military force and political appointments were not enough to keep these independent-minded nobles permanently in line, the central government needed something else. They needed a unifying cultural and ideological framework that penetrated every level of society.
Yes.
And this leads us directly to the institutionalization of religion as an instrument of state policy.
From the very beginning, Ardashir I established Zoroastrianism as the official state religion. But he did not just adopt it, he organized it. He worked closely with a highly influential high priest named Ērānšahr.
Okay.
Together, they began the massive project of standardizing religious practice across the empire.
Because Zoroastrianism had existed for centuries, but it had a lot of regional variations, right?
Exactly. Ērānšahr helped compile the scattered, orally transmitted sacred texts into a unified, state-sanctioned version of the Avesta. He established an orthodox theology and actively worked to suppress heterodox beliefs or regional variations that did not align with the central court's narrative.
This established a deeply intertwined relationship between the throne and the altar. The king protected the faith, and the priesthood legitimized the king. We see the absolute apex of this church-state alliance in the career of a high priest, or mobed, named Qartir.
Yeah, Qartir is one of the most remarkable figures in Sasanian history. He was not a king, yet he gained so much power that he served under several successive monarchs in the 3rd century, reaching the height of his influence under Bahram II.
And what is incredible is that Qartir actually commissioned his own rock inscriptions. In the ancient world, carving a massive relief into a mountainside was a prerogative strictly reserved for kings.
Usually, yes.
Yet Qartir had his own image and his own edicts carved right alongside the royal monuments.
And Qartir's inscriptions are a vital window into Sasanian religious policy. In these texts, he explicitly boasts of his efforts to aggressively enforce Zoroastrian orthodoxy. He proudly documents his systematic purges of religious minorities, specifically listing Manichaeans, Christians, Jews, and Buddhists, referring to their doctrines as demonic and actively destroying their places of worship.
It was under Qartir's direct influence that Mani, the prophet and founder of the Manichaean religion, was imprisoned and executed.
Yeah, which is a huge shift.
Because Mani had previously enjoyed the protection of earlier Sasanian kings like Shapur I, who saw Manichaeism, which blended elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism, as a potentially useful unifying religion for a diverse empire. But Qartir viewed Mani as a fundamental threat to the orthodox Zoroastrian monopoly.
Right. And to solidify this monopoly, the state massively expanded the infrastructure of the priesthood. They established and heavily funded the 3 Great Fires.
The 3 Great Fires.
Yes. These are the 3 most sacred fire temples in the empire, and they were distinctly tied to the social hierarchy. One fire represented the priesthood, another represented the warrior nobility, and the third represented the agriculturalists.
So these were not just spiritual centers, they were massive economic engines. The Great Fires and the surrounding temples were supported by vast agricultural estates known as waqf endowments. The priesthood managed the land, collected the revenues, and operated as judges and legal administrators in their districts. They were fully integrated into the imperial economy.
Because of figures like Qartir and the immense power of these temples, the extent of Sasanian religious intolerance is another subject of intense academic debate.
Okay, let's get into that.
Sure. During the Soviet era, historians like Elena Dorochenko argued that intolerance was a defining inherent feature of the Sasanian state. She viewed the empire as a rigidly oppressive theocracy that systematically crushed minority faiths to maintain class control.
However, many modern scholars, following the work of historians like Mary Boyce, argue that the Soviet interpretation is far too simplistic. They suggest that the Sasanian approach to religion was heavily pragmatic.
Very much so.
The persecutions were not constant, they were episodic, and they were almost always tied directly to geopolitics.
And the academic consensus today really leans toward this geopolitical interpretation. For instance, the Sasanian state largely tolerated its significant Christian population until the early 4th century.
What changed?
Well, the Roman Empire, under Constantine, officially adopted Christianity. Suddenly, the Sasanian kings viewed their own Christian subjects as a potential fifth-column sympathizers with the great enemy to the west.
Right, so we present the historical consensus impartially here. The idea of a completely unbroken, fanatical church-state alliance crushing all dissent was likely exaggerated.
Yeah.
Much of this narrative comes from later texts, both later Zoroastrian writings trying to project a unified golden age, and later Islamic or Christian texts aiming to paint the Sasanians as tyrannical.
Right, the daily reality was much more complex.
We know that vibrant Jewish and Christian communities thrived in Sasanian urban centers, particularly in Mesopotamia. They contributed significantly to administration, medicine, and trade, and generally faced organized state violence only when the central government suspected them of political treason. So, if we look back at Ērānšahr, the priest carving his face into the mountains, what were his actual motivations? Was his aggressive purging of minorities driven by genuine theological piety and a sincere desire to maintain the cosmic order of Ahura Mazda? Or was he a ruthless, pragmatic politician using religion as a tool to secure the borders and eliminate populations that might ally with Rome?
Well, the sources indicate it was a seamless fusion of both.
Okay.
To a Sasanian high priest, there was no separation between cosmic order and political stability. Heresy was not just a theological error. It was viewed as a literal infection that threatened the survival of the state and the king's quora.
Wow.
Purging a group with ties to a foreign enemy was simultaneously a sacred religious duty and a grim strategic necessity. The priests were integral to the administrative control of the empire, and they wielded their theological power to protect the state's earthly borders.
That strict, unyielding hierarchy at the highest levels of government and religion did not just exist in the royal courts. It trickled all the way down to dictate the daily lives, the labor, and the economic reality of the general population.
It did.
Sasanian society was engineered around a very specific, inflexible framework.
It was a highly stratified, four-tier caste system. And like the power of the king, this social structure was deeply rooted in Zoroastrian doctrine, presented as the natural, divinely ordained order of the universe.
So who was at the top?
At the absolute top were the priests, the Ērānšahr.
And below the priests were the warriors, the Ardashir. This tier was not just regular infantry. It encompassed the high nobility, the royal princes, and the elite heady cavalry.
Exactly. And then the third tier consisted of the scribes and the administrators, known as the Dabaran.
Okay, the Dabaran.
This class was crucial. They were the bureaucrats, the accountants, the physicians, and the astronomers. They were the literate class that actually kept the machinery of the empire running.
And finally, making up the vast, overwhelming majority of the population, you had the commoners, the farmers, the herdsmen, the artisans, and the merchants. They were known collectively as the Westerotian.
What defines this system, though, is its extreme rigidity. This was not a society where a successful merchant could buy his way into the nobility. The Sasanian legal code explicitly forbade social mobility.
Really? Completely forbidden?
Completely. State and religious laws strictly prohibited intermarriage between the different castes. Changing your profession from the one you were born into was a legal offense.
How do you enforce something like that across millions of people?
Right.
You enforce it through systemic exclusion, particularly regarding education. Formal education learning to read, write, and study the religious texts was legally monopolized by the nobility, the priesthood, and the scribal class.
Exactly. The commoners were intentionally legally barred from accessing education.
Because the state recognized that an uneducated populace is easier to control, they needed the Westerotian to remain in their inherited roles, tied to the land, reliably producing the agricultural surplus required to bear the empire's massive tax burden.
Because ultimately the foundation of Sasanian power was its agrarian economy. The empire relied heavily on the mass cultivation of crops like barley, wheat, dates, and cotton. But, the geography of the Iranian plateau in Mesopotamia is largely arid or semi-arid.
Right, it's not naturally lush everywhere.
No. To generate the massive agricultural surplus needed to feed the cities and fund the armies, the state had to intervene in the landscape. They required massive centralized infrastructure.
This is where Sasanian engineering becomes truly monumental. They expanded and perfected the use of qanats.
Yes, the qanats.
A qanat is a brilliant piece of ancient engineering. It is a gently sloping subterranean aqueduct that taps into a groundwater aquifer at the base of a mountain and channels the water entirely underground.
Often for dozens of miles.
Right, sometimes for dozens of miles, preventing evaporation in the desert heat until it surfaces at an agricultural settlement.
And the construction of these qanats required immense investment and highly specialized surveying knowledge. But the Sasanians did not stop at underground channels. They engineered massive surface-level hydraulic systems.
Oh, like the Shishtar system.
Exactly. The most famous example is the Shishtar historical hydraulic system in the Khuzestan province.
The Shishtar system is an interconnected complex of dams, bridges, canals, and massive siphon tunnels carved directly into the bedrock. It diverted the flow of the Karun River to irrigate vast tracts of land and power dozens of watermills.
Yeah, it's a marvel.
And there is a deeply ironic historical detail regarding its construction. Significant portions of this masterwork of Sasanian engineering were built using the forced labor of Roman engineers and soldiers who had been captured as prisoners of war during the border conflicts.
That's right.
The Sasanians utilized the technical expertise of their greatest enemy to build the infrastructure that funded their own empire.
And while agriculture was the foundation, the Sasanian economy was heavily supplemented by global trade. The empire occupied a pivotal geographic position, sitting directly athwart the major arteries of the Silk Road connecting China to the Mediterranean.
Right.
They also completely dominated the maritime trade routes in the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, and the Arabian Sea.
The Sasanian government was deeply involved in this commerce. They held strict, lucrative state monopolies on high-value transit goods, particularly Chinese silk and Indian spices. But they were also major producers themselves. They exported heavily sought-after Persian carpets, incredibly intricate textiles, and pearls harvested from the Persian Gulf to markets as far away as Europe and Tang Dynasty China.
To facilitate this massive intercontinental trade network, the state instituted a highly standardized, universally trusted currency. And the foundation of this system was the Sasanian silver dram. Yes. It was a coin weighing exactly 4 grams, struck at over 20 highly regulated royal mints across the empire. Because the purity and weight of the silver were so rigorously maintained, the Sasanian dram essentially became a ubiquitous fiat currency,
Yeah.
It was a standard medium of exchange trusted by merchants across Eurasia.
When you look at the economics, a massive historical paradox emerges. You have an empire with an incredibly rigid, isolated, and legally static internal social structure. A society where a farmer is legally barred from ever being anything but a farmer, and a blacksmith's son must be a blacksmith.
Right.
Yet, this same state manages an expansive, highly dynamic, interconnected global trade network spanning thousands of miles. How does a closed system manage an open network? It is like a tightly sealed, impenetrable vault that somehow operates as the primary clearinghouse for the entire global stock market.
It's quite a paradox. But the resolution to that paradox lies in the functionality of the third caste, the scribes of the Debrian.
The bureaucrats again.
Exactly. The bureaucracy and the specialized merchant guilds managed the complexities of the flow of goods, the tariffs, and the taxation with absolute meticulous precision.
I see.
The central government did not need the common peasantry to be dynamic, innovative, or globally minded. They needed the peasants to be static, predictable, and productive. The scribal class acted as the interface.
That makes perfect sense.
The state, the nobility, and the temples reaped the immense profits of the global trade, maintaining their strict internal order and lavish lifestyles, while interacting flexibly with the outside economic world through heavily regulated channels.
And the Sasanian kings needed every single ounce of that silver, every grain of wheat, and every tax decree, because the entire machine was perpetually tested, drained, and threatened by its great Western rival, which was the Roman Empire and later the Byzantine Empire.
The Roman-Sasanian rivalry fundamentally defined the geopolitics of late antiquity. For over 400 years, these two superpowers engaged in near-continuous, grueling warfare.
400 years.
Yeah, and the primary theaters of conflict were the contested borderlands of Mesopotamia, the rugged highlands of Armenia, and the strategic passes of the Caucasus Mountains.
This centuries-long conflict produced some of the most dramatic moments in ancient military history. In 260 CE, the Sasanian king Ērānšahr I achieved a victory that sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean. At the Battle of Edessa, Sasanian heavy cavalry decisively defeated the Roman legions, and Ērānšahr did the unthinkable.
He really did.
He captured the Roman Emperor Valerian alive on the battlefield.
And it is difficult to overstate the psychological impact of capturing a Roman emperor. Ērānšahr I ensured that this victory would never be forgotten. He commissioned massive rock reliefs at Nakh-i-Rostam, depicting the event.
What do the carvings show?
They show Ērānšahr sitting triumphantly on his warhorse, while Emperor Valerian stands before him in submission, his wrist firmly grasped by the Sasanian king.
Wow.
And historical accounts, likely embellished by Roman historians, emphasizing the humiliation claim that Ērānšahr used the captive Emperor Valerian as a human mounting block to get on his horse.
Oh, man.
And that after Valerian died in captivity, his skin was flayed, dyed red, and hung in a Sasanian temple as a permanent warning to Rome.
That is an intense visual. But the momentum swung wildly back and forth over the centuries. 100 years later, in 363 CE, the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate launched a massive, deep invasion directly into the Persian heartland.
Right.
He brought a massive army down the Euphrates River, defeating Sasanian forces and reaching the very walls of the capital to Ctesiphon.
Julian reached the capital, but he lacked the siege equipment to breach the walls. And the Sasanian king, Ērānšahr II, utilized a ruthless scorched earth strategy, completely denying the Romans any local supplies.
So they were starving.
Exactly. Julian was forced into a disastrous retreat back up the Tigris River. During a chaotic skirmish, Julian was struck by a spear and killed.
Which was a massive disaster for the Romans.
Oh, utterly. His successor, Jovian, desperate to save the starving Roman army, was forced to sign a deeply humiliating peace treaty, ceding heavily fortified frontier cities, including the vital fortress of Nisibis, back to Sasanian control.
Fast forward to the 6th century, and the two empires, exhausted by the constant drain on their treasuries, attempted to permanently stabilize the border. In 532, under the reign of Khosrow I and the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, they signed an agreement optimistically named the Eternal Peace.
Optimistically is the right word. The terms of the Eternal Peace heavily favored the Sasanians. Khosrow I managed to extract a massive tribute from Justinian, 11,000 pounds of gold, paid annually.
That is a staggering amount of money.
And the diplomatic framing was that Byzantium was subsidizing the Sasanians to maintain the fortifications of the Caucasus Mountains, supposedly protecting both empires from nomadic incursions from the Eurasian steppe. But in reality, it was extortion.
Just paying them not to attack.
Yeah, to secure the western border while Khosrow dealt with his own internal reforms.
Of course, the Eternal Peace was anything but eternal. It broke down within less than a decade, and the rivalry eventually escalated toward its absolute apocalyptic climax in the early 7th century, the Great Byzantine-Sasanian War that raged from 602 to 628.
This was a conflict of unprecedented scale.
Yeah.
It was a true total war between the ancient superpowers. The Sasanian king Khosrow II launched a massive invasion that completely overran the Byzantine eastern provinces.
Right.
The Sasanian armies swept through Mesopotamia, conquered Syria, and in 614 they captured the holy city of Jerusalem.
The capture of Jerusalem was a profound psychological blow to the Christian Byzantine Empire. The Sasanian forces seized the relic of the true cross, the wood upon which Jesus was believed to have been crucified, and carried it off as a trophy to Ctesiphon. Following that, Khosrow's armies pushed even further, achieving what no Persian king had done since the Achaemenids. They conquered Egypt, the breadbasket of the Byzantine Empire. Sasanian advance guard units even marched through Anatolia and set up camp on the Asian shores of the Bosphorus, visible from the walls of Constantinople itself.
It truly appeared to be the final days of the Byzantine Empire. They had lost their wealthiest provinces and their holiest relics. But the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius orchestrated one of the most desperate and brilliant military comebacks in history.
He didn't just surrender.
No. Rather than engaging the massive Sasanian armies occupying his territory, Heraclius took his remaining forces, sailed across the Black Sea, allied with Turkic nomads in the Caucasus, and launched a daring winter counteroffensive directly into the unprotected Persian heartland.
And Heraclius' gamble paid off. He bypassed the main Sasanian field armies and struck at the core of the empire. In December 627, Heraclius engaged a Sasanian army at the Battle of Nineveh. The Byzantine forces won a decisive victory, shattering the Sasanian military resistance and destroying a key royal palace, which terrified the Sasanian nobility.
And if you step back and look at the entirety of the Roman-Sasanian conflict,
Yep.
It was essentially a 400-year geopolitical stalemate.
Really? All that for a stalemate.
Pretty much.
Mhm.
Despite these massive territorial shifts during specific campaigns, entire provinces changing hands, emperors captured or killed, relics stolen, the borders almost always reverted to the status quo. These were wars of attrition.
Right.
By the end of the final conflict in 628, both the Byzantine and Sasanian superpowers were economically devastated. Their treasuries were empty, their militaries were exhausted, and their civilian populations had been heavily overtaxed and decimated by plague.
That catastrophic level of exhaustion set the stage for one of history's most sudden, complete, and shocking imperial collapses. The Sasanian machine, which had run for 4 centuries and just years earlier had controlled Egypt and threatened Constantinople, was about to tear itself apart from the inside right as a new, unimaginable threat appeared on the horizon.
The disaster at Nineveh led directly to the downfall of Khosrow II. The Sasanian nobility, furious at the endless ruinous war, overthrew and assassinated him in 628.
Okay.
And this assassination triggered devastating, chaotic 4-year civil war.
So the central authority that Ardashir had built completely eroded. The noble factions turned on each other. Over the course of just 4 years, the empire saw an astonishing 14 different rulers claim the throne.
14.
Huh.
The royal Sasanian bloodline was systematically decimated by internal purges. The desperation was so severe that 2 women, Queen Boran and her sister Queen Azarmidok, were elevated to the throne.
Which was highly unusual, right?
Very. While Sasanian women could wield significant influence, reigning in sovereign monarchs was highly unusual and strictly a measure of last resort, because the male heirs had been slaughtered.
Finally, in 632, a faction of the nobility managed to locate a surviving male heir and placed Yasgurd III on the throne. But Yasgurd was not a strong, experienced general. He was an 8-year-old boy.
Poor kid. Yasgurd III inherited a fundamentally fractured, dying realm. The treasury was completely depleted. The Parthian noble houses had effectively seceded, prioritizing their own regional survival over the central state.
Right.
And fundamentally, the agricultural base of the empire was failing. The massive irrigation systems, the quadrats and canals, had suffered from decades of neglect as manpower was diverted to the wars.
It was at this exact moment of maximum structural vulnerability, with the empire bleeding from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds, that a new, entirely unprecedented threat emerged from the arid deserts to the south. The Arab armies of the newly unified Rashidun Caliphate.
Yes. Unified by the newly established Islamic faith, the Arab tribes were forged into a highly mobile, deeply motivated military force. Their early incursions into Sasanian territory were remarkably swift.
Right.
In 633, Arab cavalry forces achieved significant victories at the battles of Walaja and Ulays, easily overrunning the undersupplied, demoralized Sasanian frontier garrisons in southern Mesopotamia.
The Sasanian court eventually recognized the existential severity of the threat and managed to scrape together a massive imperial army for a decisive confrontation. This occurred at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, fought around 636. The Sasanians fielded a force heavily equipped with their traditional elite units, the heavily armored Savaran cavalry, and a terrifying corps of war elephants imported from India.
On paper, the Sasanian army should have crushed the lighter Arab forces, but the accounts of Al-Qadisiyah highlight the friction and rot within the Sasanian machine. The Arab forces, commanded by Khalid ibn al-Walid and later Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, utilized superior tactical flexibility, leveraging the open terrain to maneuver their lighter, faster cavalry.
And the environmental conditions also played a massive role, didn't they?
Oh, huge.
During the multi-day battle, severe, blinding dust storms blew out of the desert directly into the faces of the Sasanian heavy troops, blinding their archers and exhausting their infantry. Furthermore, the Sasanian forces were plagued by internal divisions. The troops had gone unpaid, and the noble commanders from different great houses refused to coordinate effectively.
And the turning point involved those Sasanian war elephants.
Right.
Initially, the beasts terrified the Arab horses and shattered the front lines, but the Arab commanders adapted. They ordered their infantry to specifically target the elephants' eyes and trunks with spears and arrows.
Oh, that sounds chaotic.
It was. The injured beasts panicked, turned around, and began aggressively trampling through their own Sasanian lines, breaking the army's formation and causing a catastrophic rout. The Sasanian commander, Rustam Farrukhzad, was killed in the chaos.
The disaster at Al-Qadisiyah broke the back of the Sasanian military. The Arab forces advanced rapidly on the capital. The great city of Ctesiphon, once the jewel of the Near East, fell in 637. The royal treasury was looted, and the Sasanian court fled eastward. The remnants of the Sasanian field armies attempted to regroup, but they were finally conclusively shattered a few years later at the Battle of Nahevond in 642, an engagement the Arab chroniclers called the Victory of Victories.
The story of the final Sasanian monarch, Yazdegerd III, serves as a tragic, deeply symbolic vignette of this collapse.
Yeah.
The last king of kings, whose ancestors had carved their faces into mountains and demanded tribute from Rome, spent the last 19 years of his life as a desperate fugitive.
He fled constantly eastward, moving from province to province, begging his own regional governors, the remaining Parthian lords, and even foreign powers like the Tang dynasty in China for an army to reclaim his throne.
But the governors repeatedly shut their gates to him.
Finally, in 651, the last Sasanian emperor met his end. He was not killed leading a heroic final charge on a battlefield. He was murdered while hiding in a grain mill in the eastern city of Merv. He was killed by a humble local miller who simply wanted to steal his royal jewelry and his purse.
The suddenness of this fall from a superpower to total disintegration in less than 3 decades remains one of the most heavily debated topics in historical scholarship.
What are the main theories?
Well, what was the primary mechanism of collapse? Was it the military brilliance, the unparalleled mobility, and the unifying religious zeal of the incoming Arab forces? Or was it internal Sasanian rot?
Historians approach this massive question from multiple angles.
Yes. As we discussed earlier with the historiography, scholars like Parvana Pourchariati argue strongly that the fall was fundamentally an internal political collapse. In her analysis, the Parthian noble houses, absolutely exhausted by central taxation and the endless, pointless wars initiated by Khosrow II, simply abandoned the Sasanian kings.
Just walked away.
Yeah. When the Arab armies arrived, rather than rallying to defend the central throne at Ctesiphon, many of these regional warlords chose to negotiate their own localized treaties and surrenders with the caliphate, preserving their own estates and local power.
And recently, historians are incorporating new scientific data to add another layer to this debate. Environmental historians, looking at tree rings and ice core data, suggest that the region suffered from severe climatic anomalies, a period sometimes called the Late Antique Little Ice Age.
That's fascinating.
This resulted in extended severe droughts affecting the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia in the late 6th and early 7th centuries.
And that environmental data is crucial. A sustained drought would have placed immense, unbearable strain on the agrarian economy. It would have drastically reduced crop yields, leading to famine, decreasing tax revenues, and exacerbating the financial crises caused by the Byzantine Wars.
So it wasn't just one thing.
Right, we must present these perspectives impartially. It was not a single cause. It was likely a perfect storm, a convergence of military exhaustion, the deliberate political abandonment by the aristocracy, and severe environmental stress, which collectively paralyzed the state apparatus and allowed the highly motivated, tactically brilliant Arab forces to dismantle the empire piece by piece.
It is a profound historical pivot. The empire fell, the Sasanian dynasty was extinguished, and the Arab conquests entirely redrew the political, religious, and cultural map of the Middle East. But the legacy of this 400-year superpower is deeply complex.
And this brings us to a final thought for you to consider as we close this deep dive.
Okay.
The Sasanian state collapsed violently, but the Sasanian machinery did not disappear. As the newly established Islamic caliphates, first the Umayyads and later the Abbasids, transitioned from conquering armies to administrators of a massive empire, they looked for a working blueprint.
Yeah, they needed a system.
And they adopted the Sasanian administrative systems almost entirely. The land registries, the postal networks, the coinage system, the taxation structures, and even the courtly culture and the concept of a divinely appointed absolute monarch heavily influenced the Islamic caliphs in Baghdad.
They took the blueprint. The conquerors took the territory and brought a new religion. But the intricate, rigid culture of the conquered Sasanian administration ultimately shaped the structure of the conqueror's new empire. The great Sasanian skyscraper fell, but its conceptual steel beams were salvaged to build the next dominant power in the Middle East. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.